So I'm going to be talking about different risk factors for ALS worldwide. Sorry. Okay, so I conducted extensive research on different genetic, environmental, and occupational risk factors for ALS worldwide, and examined the mechanisms in which these factors caused ALS in an attempt to raise awareness of these factors and the potential harm that they could cause. So what is ALS? So amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, is a rare neurodegenerative disease. It causes upper and lower motor neuron degeneration and death. So upper motor neurons run from the primary motor cortex of your brain to the spinal cord, and then the lower motor neurons run from the spinal cord to your muscles. So it kind of signals, and that's how you can move your limbs and your muscles. So it usually develops in adults over 40, but there's an exception, which is early onset ALS, which is even more rare. And it's always fatal, usually within 2 to 5 years. So it's a really devastating disease. And there's no definite causes that have been proved 100%, and there's no cure. So symptoms usually appear as muscle deterioration and weakness. The symptoms will eventually spread from voluntary muscles, like in your arms and legs, to respiratory muscles, so it causes difficulty breathing, and it eventually leads to paralysis. So in this image, you can kind of see on the right, the damaged neuron can't properly transmit the signal to the muscle, so it's unable to contract. Okay, so there's 2 types of ALS. There's familial ALS, or FALS, and that kind of composes 10% of cases, so it's not as common. It's caused by genetic factors in people, so it's usually in people with a family history of ALS. And then there's sporadic ALS, which is in the other 90% of cases. So it appears randomly, and there's in people with no family history. And the onset of sporadic ALS is usually later than familial ALS, and we don't know why this is. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some of the mechanisms that ALS causes neurodegeneration. So one of these is oxidative stress. So it arises when there's increased concentrations of reactive free radicals. These are atoms that have an unpaired valence electron. So they're very reactive and very unstable. So then this occurs with the simultaneous dysfunctional antioxidant system. So antioxidants basically regulate the levels of free radicals in your body. So then this causes cell damage and death. And then there's exotoxicity. So this occurs when there's a neurotransmission disruption. It can be caused by the overactivation of glutamate receptors. So this leads to an accumulation of calcium ions that then overwhelm the mitochondria. And then this leads to the mitochondria releasing cytochrome C, which induces apoptosis and cell death. And then also there's protein aggregation. So when there's a mutation in a gene, it can cause a mutated protein, and then these mutated proteins sometimes stick together in clusters, and these are called aggregates. So then these aggregates will build up in neurons and kind of block normal cell functions and cause the neuron to die. Okay, so something I want to point out is that there's not one single factor that causes ALS. It's usually a result of an interaction between factors. So, for example, a genetic factor could cause some sort of susceptibility to a certain environmental factor, and then exposures to these environmental factors could lead to ALS development. Okay, so I'm going to start with genetic risk factors. Okay, so one of the biggest genetic risk factors is actually gender. Males have a 1.5 greater risk of developing ALS. This could have a gender genetic basis, but it could also be caused by different environmental exposures between genders. One thing that's thought to be the cause of this is levels of fetal testosterone. So obviously, men have higher levels of this when they're developing in the womb. So fetal testosterone actually impacts the relative lengths of the second and fourth finger. So it's found that ALS patients had a greater difference in their second and fourth finger lengths. So yeah. I know.
Everyone immediately checks their fingers.
Okay, and then gene mutations. So these are some of the most common gene mutations found in ALS cases. So first is SOD1, which basically the gene codes for enzymes that regulate the free radicals. So basically a dysfunctional SOD1 protein would lead to increased free radicals. And then there's the TAR DNA binding protein, which codes for TDP43, which is RNA and DNA binding protein. So mutated TDP43 protein can lead to protein aggregation and mitochondrial harm, which then leads to free radical overproduction because the mitochondria does produce the free radicals. And then there's chromosome 9 open reading frame 72, which codes for proteins in the motor neurons in the brain. So this can either be a loss of function mutation, which leads to decreasing functional proteins, or a gain of function mutation, which can lead to increasing numbers of mutated proteins, thus leading to protein aggregation. Okay, so next is environmental risk factors, and there's a lot more environmental risk factors than genetic risk factors. Okay, so one of them is thought to be heavy metals because they're neurotoxic. Some of the ways that these metals can cause ALS or just neurodegenerative disease is by causing mutations in proteins, which could then lead to protein aggregation or oxidative stress. Another thing to keep in mind is that the levels of these metals in certain areas can also increase the risk of ALS. So there's higher levels of selenium in South Dakota and Italy, which kind of corresponds to the higher cases of ALS in those areas. So in South Dakota, it was found that a lot of livestock had selenium poisoning. And then in Italy, there was selenium in the water supply. So that's thought to contribute to the ALS cases. And then BMAA is a big one. It's a non-proteinogenic amino acid produced by 90% of cyanobacterial species. So it can contribute to cell death in 3 ways. Basically, it can deplete glutathione, which is an antioxidant, which regulates free radicals, so then leading to increased free radicals and oxidative stress. It can also overstimulate glutamate receptors, leading to overproduction of the calcium ions, and then it can cause cytochrome C release. It can also be misincorporated into the TDP43 protein instead of serine, so then it leads to the misfolded proteins and protein aggregation, and all these lead to neuron cell death. Okay, pesticides is another. There's like a variety of ways you can be exposed to it through inhalation, ingestion, direct contact. Obviously, there's pesticides in like food. That's how it's ingested. It's thought to permanently inhibit an enzyme which then prevents it from breaking down a neurotransmitter. So then this leads to the overstimulation of a receptor protein, leading to exotoxicity. It can also cause oxidative stress, mitochondrial damage, and neuron death. Okay, EMFs are another. There's high-frequency and low-frequency EMFs, but most of the cases that I researched focused on low-frequency EMFs, which can include power lines and radio waves. So these are thought to increase free radicals and decrease and damage antioxidants, causing oxidative stress and then thus cell death. Okay. So a bunch of environmental factors can contribute to ALS clusters. So there's so these clusters kind of arise when there's a high number of ALS cases relative to the population size. So the most significant clusters are actually in the Western Pacific, on the island of Guam, and Kii Peninsula in Japan. And these are both thought to be related to the BMAA, which are in cycad plants, which I'll get to. Okay, so Guam. So there's a plant native to Guam called the cycad plant, and it has very high levels of BMAA because of the cyanobacteria living symbiotically in the roots. So it causes very high levels. And the native population uses the cycad to make flour, but it's been proved that this preparation removes around 85% of the BMAA. But it's thought to cause ALS because of the biomagnification of this BMAA through the food chain. So native animals will consume these cycad plant seeds, and then it'll biomagnify through the food chain, and then the native population will eat the animals, causing them to have high levels of BMAA in them. Okay, so then the Key Peninsula. So this is also thought to be related to the cycad plants and the BMAA, but there's another potential cause, and it could be mineral deficiencies. This could arise from low calcium and magnesium levels in the water, and then simultaneously there's high levels of toxic metals in the soil. So this leads to a hypoparathyroidism. So this basically means that there's gastrointestinal absorption of these minerals, and consequently the metals. And then this leads to the deposition of these minerals and metals in nerve cell tissue. So this leads to cell death because of the toxicity of the metals. Okay, and I just want to say before this that it's not the actual occupation that is linked to the ALS cases, but more so the tasks and exposures that you'll experience with these occupations. So one of the biggest occupational risk factors is actually military service. This can be linked to strenuous physical activity, physical and psychological trauma such as head injuries, toxic materials like pesticides, heavy metals like lead and copper, which are actually found in ammunition fumes, and hydrocarbon fuels to fuel the like military or aircrafts, and then any other exposures related to deployment areas such as like viruses. And then physical activity is actually thought to be related to ALS cases because it's thought to increase the free radicals, creating oxidative stress. Okay, so additionally, electrical occupations due to their exposures to heavy metals and EMFs. Construction work due to physical activity and then exposure to toxic metals as well. And then agricultural work due to the pesticide use. And agriculture workers are actually found to have a 3 times greater risk of developing ALS. And then especially athletic professions, soccer and football have been a really big focus of a lot of ALS demographic studies. Football players have actually been found to have a 4 times greater risk of developing ALS. So some of these things that could be linked are strenuous physical activity again, head trauma, exposure to pesticides that may be used to treat the fields, and use of performance-enhancing drugs. So with the strenuous physical activity, like I said before, it's thought to increase free radicals, but then this in combination with use of any type of drugs would just enhance the effects. Okay, so some implications for the research is that it can hopefully raise awareness for the different exposures and that can potentially cause this disease, as well as genetic predispositions, because again, like I said before, the interaction between the genetic and environmental factors is what is thought to lead to ALS. So this could allow for future preventative measures by maybe decreasing occupational exposures to certain factors that I've listed before. Yeah.
Right.
Since we know about, or not we, I guess, since you know about all these things, and how well known is it to those populations that are in these professions that are at high risk, and is there conversations with those, let's say, agricultural workers, and how to prevent, if that's your occupation, is there preventative measures that they're discussing with work, like how, are there conversations, is there communication, or is this just a secret, like, good luck?
Don't mess with it.
Well, it's definitely not discussed because there's been increasing research about this, and there's still so much that we don't know about this disease. And not all like the studies have been perfect, but I think as like they're gathering more information about the occupational risks, they are kind of leaning towards starting to inform them more about it. So yeah.
You said, did you say there was other organisms got ALS? Like there was a population of cows somewhere?
No, I just said the livestock.
Or it was higher concentration?
Yes, but they do studies on mice and rats because they do have similar like reactions.
Okay.
So that's how they test if metals will cause a certain effect.
So other organisms could get ALS?
ALS like symptoms.
even if not specifically ALS.
Yes.
I'm just wondering, because with the cyanobacteria, such a large percentage of them producing the BMAA, and we have cyanobacterial blooms in the lagoon.
Yeah.
It just makes me curious how the organisms.
Because they're also called
are
blue-green
doing.
algae, so
Yeah.
with the algal blooms, yeah.
So are fish affected by that?
Yeah, they do. It does bioaccumulate in aquatic species.
So then we eat the fish.
Yeah.
Don't eat the fish.
Yeah.
But I think about our athletes as well. Like, are we using currently pesticides on athletic fields in high school that are gonna impact kids later in their lives?
Yeah, what I did find interesting though was it was predominantly professional athletes that experienced the high rise in ALS cases, not just for like school. But that might just be more for like increased exposures to these things.
Sienna, I wonder if you can tell us a little more about some of the sources that you used, which ones were the most helpful to you for your research, and what did you learn?
I just researched a bunch of case studies on mice, rats, demographic studies on certain occupations and like the risk, the percentages that developed ALS later along the line. Yeah.
Was there like one particular source that was really informative for your research?
I mean, there were so many different topics. It was really just everything.
For the community in Guam and Key, like what's the percentage or likelihood of ALS?
I don't know off the top of my head. I just know that relative to the population size, there's very high rates of ALS development.
Can animals have ALS, right? That was the question. What about flies? Maybe you know something
Again,
about
yeah,
ALS.
like ALS-like disease, not exactly, but that's why flies have been used to model ALS in humans. So you expose flies to certain environmental factors and see how it affects them neurologically.
Does Dr. Schaefer work with ALS patients?
Yes.
Do we have
What are free radicals and why do they cause protein degradation?
They're atoms that have an unpaired valence electron, so they're very unstable and very reactive, so they can just cause harm to the cell and to the mitochondria.
That's good. Other thing you have, AP chemistry questions. Other thing you have is copper versus zinc concentration in these DNA accumulation. Why is having more copper a cause of concern? Why is there oxidative stress because of the copper?
I believe it has to do with the SOD1 protein, because it's also copper zinc dismutase 1.
Which
So
one is more reactive between those two?
copper zinc.
Yeah.
Okay. Just
Got
an
it,
easy question.
50-50.
I don't want to answer wrong. Copper?
Copper is, like if you have a copper container, it will be good for some time. Zinc will rust away.
Okay.
So if you have copper accumulation, it won't go away because
Yeah.
it's not reactive.
Yeah.
Zinc will be replaced by something else. Okay.
Sienna, if I know you're mostly focusing on like causes, is there a way, like when a person gets diagnosed for ALS, they can determine if it was more genetic versus more environmental, and therefore, like in terms of treatment, how difficult does that make it to determine? I know it's incurable, but in terms of like helping the person through the condition as much as they can, how much does like if you got ALS from genetic factors or some effect, if you know of it, like the way that they are cared for?
I don't believe it affects it very much. Yeah, it just,
Same.
usually if you have a family history, it's probably more genetic.
If you know you have a family history, is there anything that can be done to prevent like
But again, it's like a combination. It's not going to be just genetic and just environmental.
I guess if you know all the environmental impacts, stay away from all things possible if you already have a genetic. Yeah, I mean, don't be an agricultural worker or a professional football player.
But it was also concerning to see we're using all of the things that are in the danger zone. When you put that slide up about was it slow waves or?
Yeah, but you'd
I
need to be
know.
exposed for a prolonged period of time. So
Yeah.
it would have to be extensive exposure for long periods of time.
Other than the causal agents, what's being done with ALS and treatment?
There are some studies being done, like I know of at Duke University. They're doing some treatments with different drugs to see if it makes an effect, but right now there's really not a lot that can be done.
Quick question. How much money did they raise with Ice Bucket Challenge? Like, that was a thing about it.
That's like 10 years ago.
That was the
They
last-
were like third grade at that point, probably.
So the money was going to the
Yes,
research.
that's when I first heard about ALS because.
I remember the Ice Bucket Challenge, I did not remember that it was,
Yeah.
the proceeds were going to ALS research.
That's what I first
So do you know about that?
heard.
Did you do the Ice Bucket Challenge? My kids did.
How quickly do you, what's the, when the time you're diagnosed, how quickly do you, go to, it's a very serious situation where you're really
Yeah.
bedridden and worse?
Usually from the onset of symptoms, it's 2 to 5 years, but there are some exceptions. Obviously, Stephen Hawking lived for so long after. But yeah, usually 2 to 5-ish years.
But that's for death, you're saying to become seriously
Incapacitated.
incapacitated.
I think it varies among people. So
Do they know whether he had a genetic or do they know where his whatever decided for him?
I'm not sure.
Why did you, what's your interest in this topic? I'm just out of curiosity.
I mean, I love Stephen Hawking. Also, my great uncle had ALS, and he traveled a lot, so I was just very interested in what he was exposed to or what could have caused that, because it doesn't really run in our family. So
Did you figure out where he might have, what exposure he might have?
he did travel to Bali a lot, which does have psychad there too, but it's not for sure, but.
All right, thank you.